Thank you, Jack. Well, it's really a privilege to be here. This is a fun place to come. I actually have a sister-in-law and brother-in-law that live here. My wife grew up in St. Cloud, so not too far from here. So this is a fun place with lots of family ties. As Jack mentioned, I have a 6-week-old that was born 2 days after Jordan's little one. The crazier part of it is I also have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. So I am deep in diaper town right now. So my wife commanded me to sleep in as much as I could this morning because she knew I'd be at a hotel. So just really excited to be here. So if you had a chance to look at the schedule, you'll notice that I chose a pretty audacious title. Be a hero, change the world, do what you love. Those 3 things, my wife actually kind of smirked when I told her what the title was going to be. She's like, well, you're kind of biting off a lot for one presentation. Be a hero, change the world, and do what you love. I thought that those 3 things were so important because I think there's something that starts in every person's heart and mind and life as a kid. You know, I get the privilege of parenting 3 little kids, and I'm amazed at how those themes emerged in their little hearts from a very early age. They want to be heroes. They want to save the day. Watching them play these little games, boys and girls, and seeing them play together and taking turns, who's the superhero, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who gets to save the day. And those are themes that are central, I think, to every child's upbringing, but so often something happens in the sort of realism of life that at some point we often stop believing that it's realistic to be a hero, to change the world, and certainly to do what you love. I mean, I remember in college that daunting task of trying to figure out, what do I love? What do I do with my life? As a kid, for me, it started with this sort of infatuation with superheroes. I don't know if anybody remembers the A-Team. Yeah, digging deep for the A-Team. Yeah, I was a big fan of the A-Team, G.I. Joes, and it's fun to see my kids already starting to have their favorite superheroes. And if you look at the superheroes of today, and you see sort of like the big one right now, the comic series, The Avengers, that I don't know, every other month there's a new Avengers movie coming out. I don't even know anymore who's the good guy because now the Avengers are fighting each other. But if you think about it, what it is about superheroes, it's interesting because most of the superhero characters that sort of achieve celebrity, they have these superpowers. And so it's easy to sort of think, well, Superman's a superhero because he can fly, or Thor is this sort of invincible guy that can do all kinds of stuff with his magic hammer. But it really has nothing to do with their powers, and it has everything to do with how those powers intersect people in their time of need, right? In other words, if they just had those powers and they didn't actually save the day, if they didn't do something to intersect with somebody in their time of need, nobody would watch the movie. I mean, maybe some of the ladies would watch Thor just walking around with his shirt off and a big heavy hammer, just, throwing the boomerang and smashing walls. But most of us aren't nobody wants to see Iron Man just fly from like penthouse pool party to penthouse pool party and just impress people. Or, that they're superheroes not because of their powers, but because of how those assets, those gifts, those tools intersect people in their time of need. So as a kid, I used to dream about what would it be like to save the day? What would it be like to be so critical in a situation, in somebody's time of need, that I actually get to be the hero? And I kind of had this dream about that as a kid, like someday I want to save the day. Well, when I was 10 years old, I got my chance. I had a neighbor, grew up in this small town, and on this big piece of property, not a lot of neighbors around, but there was one kid that lived up the street who was a few years younger than me, and his name was Willie. And Willie and I would play outside in the summer for hours on end, and when I was probably about 10 years old, and he would have been about 7, we're playing out in the woods, and we had this little swamp, this kind of old ditch that would accumulate full of water. We're from Seattle where it rains a lot, and so there's a lot of water. And it was this really kind of gross, slimy, like bullfrogs and lily pads and just kind of sludge that grew. And there was a tree that had fallen over it. Now this space was probably about the size of this stage, and we never really knew how deep the water was. Again, it's only maybe 6-8 feet wide. We thought the water was, probably 1,000 feet deep in our childhood imagination, and it was dark and dirty. And this tree had fallen over. And so we had the idea. I mean, you only had to go down about 100 feet to walk around it, but we thought, we're going to be adventurous. We're going to climb over the log and cross the chasm. And so Willie starts going first, and he's terrified, and I'm egging him on a little bit. And, this tree's hanging only probably about 4 feet over the swamp. And so he's scooching out, and Willie slips. And he spins around, and he's hanging onto the bottom of the log, and he's crying for dear life. And I think it's amazing. I think this is about to be the best case scenario. Willie plunges into his demise of the sludge. And, we knew that really it was probably only about 2 or 3 feet deep, and it was just really gross. And we live in Seattle where we don't have any poisonous snakes or poisonous spiders or alligators or crocodiles. So worst case scenario, he gets a mouthful of dirty, gross slime. So I think this is great. Willie's not sold. Willie is terrified. He is screaming bloody murder, and he's crying out for help. He's saying, help me, I'm going to fall. So I'm kind of debating, do I let it happen? Do I, okay. So I climb out there, and I grab Willie, and I pull him up, and we go back. And we keep playing. Well, a couple hours later, we get back to his house, and we walk in, and he runs in, and he looks at his mom with a serious look. He says, Mom, you're not going to believe it. Jeremy saved my life today. And I'm like, man, if this is being a hero, I just got shortchanged. Because I dreamed about the day I could save somebody's life, and now Willie tells me I've arrived, and it is not very fulfilling. I do not feel like I saved his life. But for him, in that moment, I had this chance to intersect in his time of need, of something that for him was going to be very scary, very traumatic, very tragic. And it didn't really feel like I did anything. I mean, all I had to do was grab him. I was big enough. He was a small kid. And so I kind of reflected on that experience and sort of just dismissed it. I thought, that was silly, I didn't save his life, and, his mom kind of could tell that, okay, it probably wasn't that big of a deal. Well, several years later, a little over a decade later, I grew up looking at Mount Rainier, which Mount Rainier is the most glaciated peak in the lower 48 of the United States. It's kind of a training ground for Mount Everest. People come from all over the world to climb Mount Rainier, and it dominates the skyline of Seattle if you've ever seen it. And so I grew up as a kid dreaming about climbing that mountain. Well, my mom wasn't so hot on that idea, and so I made a deal with my folks that if I wanted to climb, that they would help me pay for a class to learn how to mountaineer. They didn't want me just kind of going up there with my basketball shoes and seeing what happened, because people do die every year on the mountain. So it's a serious mountain, and so we found this 6-day course on glacier mountaineering on a nearby mountain to Mount Rainier, where you go spend 6 days on the ice, getting dropped into crevasses, learning all how to tie the knots and the ropes and the crampons and the ice axe. So I did that, and as we're driving up to this class, I didn't know anybody. I had just signed up. I ended up being the youngest person in the group, and there was a couple professional guides that are leading the class, and one of the guys had flown out from the Midwest, and he was telling us that this is his training for when he's going to climb Everest. And he was about 20 years older. I'm a 21-year-old kid. This guy's 20, 25 years older than me. So I'm super intimidated. I'm thinking, okay, this guy, he's a dad. He's got kids. He's going to go climb Everest. I'm the young guy. Did I sign up for the wrong class? What did I get myself into? So we get up there. We do 6 days of training. And on the last day, we set out to summit the mountain. Well, I had never climbed a mountain before, so I don't know what's going on, and we have these guides, so I'm just saying, well, I'm tied to a rope, and I'm on the very back of the rope, and the guide's on the front, and there's 2 people in between us. So I'm like, well, all I have to do is follow this rope. My job's easy. And we get hit by this complete whiteout storm, like ice blowing, and probably every 15 minutes, you'd have to shake your arms and your legs because the ice would start solidifying on the side of your body. It was so cold. Well, I grew up as in a Boy Scouts type program when my dad always drilled in, you got to be prepared for everything. And so I had the biggest pack. I had extra gloves, extra jackets. So we're in this thing, and I'm on the rope. I'm just walking. I'm thinking, and I can't see anything. It's such a whiteout. I can't even see the person on the rope in front of me. I'm thinking, this is the craziest thing. This is amazing. This must be what mountain climbing is always like. And I'm putting on all these layers, and I've got multiple gloves. I'm like the snowman walking up the mountain. And we get to the top of the mountain, and what I didn't realize is that the other 2 people on our rope weren't prepared. And it was so cold and so windy, and the guide was on a mission to get us up there and back safely, that he didn't do a great job of checking in with them. And so we get to the top, and the girl behind him was getting hypothermic. So he focuses on her, and he looks at me. He's like, "How you doing?" I'm like, "This is amazing. I'm great. I'm toasty." And then all of a sudden, the guy in front of me, this guy who's going to go climb Everest, flops down on the summit in the storm, and he says, "I can't do it." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? You can't do what? Like, we did it." He's like, "I can't go on. You have to leave me here." It's like, What do you mean? He's like, "Tell my wife and kids I tried. Just leave me here. I'm done. Like, I have nothing left. It's over for me." And he's dead serious. And again, I was like thinking like this moment with Willie where I'm like kind of like, I kind of think it's funny, but I'm like, what's going on here? So I'm like, "Well, what are you talking?" He's like, "I can't even feel my fingers." And he has these little gloves. I'm like, "Do you want I got an extra pair of gloves." He's like, "But I'm so cold." I'm like, "Well, I got another jacket. Like, what do you need?" And so we get them all bundled up, and we start going down the mountain. And we come to this first little crevasse that's probably a couple feet across, and you kind of have to jump over it. And I'm like, "All right, we can do this. Let's do it." And he sits down. He's like, "No, I'm done. It's over. Leave me behind. Cut the rope." And so in my head, I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of this out-of-body experience. Like, if this was a movie, what would happen? What would the main character do right now? So 21-year-old me gets in the face of this 45-year-old businessman, and I grab him by the collar, and I shake him and say, "I will get you off this mountain!" And I'm like, "Pull yourself together!" And so he kind of pulls himself together, and in the back, I'm like trying to keep a straight face, thinking this is all ridiculous. Long story short, we make it back to the car, and the guy goes silent. He's totally quiet until we get to this little burger joint on our way home. And I'm still thinking, like, this was the coolest experience ever. This was fantastic. And as we get out, he kind of lingers behind, and everyone gets out, and they're going to the restaurant, and he grabs my arm, and he said, "You saved my life this morning." And I'm like, "No, I didn't. That was crazy, though." And he's like, no, you saved my life today. And again, I'm thinking, dang it. Like, I want to be a hero, and now I had a fleece and some extra gloves, and I gave you some terrible movie script motivational speech. And that's me getting to be a hero. Like, this just it didn't feel very heroic. But it was sort of, that moment sort of connected the dots with this experience as a 10-year-old kid, with Willie and with this guy, realizing that being a hero is not about having superpower. It's not being abnormally equipped compared to the person next to you, being stronger, faster, better, more intelligent. It's being present in somebody's time of need and responding with the things that God has given you, the tools that God has given you. And I think we've created this view and this version of these superpowers that sort of takes us out of that role of responsibility where we don't actually think we have what it takes to be a superhero. And the models that we get, we occasionally hear of those abnormal feats of strength, or we get the feature on the evening news, but the reality is the most heroic things in life usually don't end up on the evening news. It's that person who invests in a young kid when there's nobody else speaking into their lives, nobody else that believes in them, somebody that comes alongside of them at the right time. I think about Jesus and how he brought together this group of very unextraordinary people, right? His disciples, this group of misfits who were uneducated, who smelled like fish, and brought them together, and they were essentially like plan A, B, and C. Like, I'm going to invest in these people, and then when I go, I'm going to commission them to go and be these heroes. And there's a verse in Acts that I think captures this very well. As Peter's walking around, and this beggar says, this cripple says, "I need money. Can you help me?" And Peter's response is, "I'm sorry, I don't have what you think you need. Silver and gold I do not have, but what I have I'll give you. Rise up and walk." And this man is healed. I think that's the essence of what we're called to as believers, is that we're called to sort of identify, who is it that God made me? What are the skills that he's given me? What are the passions? What are the longings? Who am I in my ordinary self? And how can I leverage that to intersect with the people around me in their times of need? And to do that, the fundamental requirement is simply faithful presence. You can't really set out to go and be the superhero. In other words, now, if I said, okay, well, the model is find a 7-year-old hanging over a swamp, or find a 45-year-old man screaming to leave him behind on the mountain. Okay, I'm going to dedicate my life. I just need to go find as many of those scenarios, and then I get to save lives. No, it's actually much more about being present and knowing what God has given you. As Jack mentioned in the intro, in 2008, I got a chance to go on a trip to India. And I had no particularly noble agenda. This wasn't like some great mission trip or humanitarian trip. I got invited by a friend, and I really like curry, and I like traveling. So I'm thinking, this is going to be great. Food, culture, travel, I'll go. And I had no idea that God would radically transform my life on that trip. On the tail end of the trip, we were catching our international flight home out of Mumbai, and we had about 24 hours. We flew in one evening and then left late the next evening. So we land at the airport, get picked up by this incredible humanitarian Indian man and this husband and wife couple that had been working in India for 45 years. And they said, hey, you've got 24 hours here. These were friends of my friend that took me, so I'm just kind of along for the ride. They said, we want to tell you about human trafficking. So they drove us into what at the time was the largest red light district in the world. Within 11 square blocks, they estimated about 75,000 women and children in sexual slavery in 11 square blocks. So essentially, about the downtown core, 75,000 people in sexual slavery. Now, I was a small town kid and had never seen anything like that. So in the middle of the night, on kind of peak business hours, they drive us into this red light district, and you're surrounded by exploitation. Girls lining the streets as far as the eye can see, and then men marching down the street, disappearing into these caged buildings and dark alleys. The thing that came to mind was sort of like if hell had a Macy's Day Parade, that's what it would look like. Like it was a parade of men taking these young girls. And my blood boiled. My first reaction, honestly, was justice. My wife and I joke sometimes that I'm justice and she's mercy, which plays out well for my kids. But my first reaction was justice. I was like, okay, well, let's just put snipers on every one of these buildings and just start dropping people. Obviously, that's not the solution, but I felt like, man, something has to change. And we went back to the hotel that night. It was probably one of the worst nights of sleep I had, just trying to process how does this happen in the world that I live in. The next day, they took us to see the other side of the story. They said, we're going to go to the homes for kids that have been rescued out of those brothels. So the first place we went to was a home for children under the age of 12 who were all HIV positive. And so as they tell us where we're going, I'm preparing myself for something that I think is going to be dark and sort of somber and maybe a medical kind of sterile, whitewashed environment where kids who had had their souls ripped out from them were just institutionalized and sort of sent to spend the remainder of the days. And when I walked in, it was anything but that. These kids were full of joy and life, and they nearly knocked me off my feet, singing songs and teaching me the Indian version of patty cake and running around. And I had no paradigm for that level of hope in contrast to such darkness. I mean, I grew up in a Christian environment. I sang the songs like Amazing Grace. I was blind, but now I see. But for me, when I said I was blind, I didn't really know what that meant. Because I had grown up in a great home and in a great town, and I hadn't seen much injustice. But for these kids, they grew up in hell. They grew up with a level of darkness that is probably the worst form of exploitation you can imagine on this planet. And then now they're full of life and joy and hope, and they're singing, and God suddenly got so much bigger for me. The next home was a home for teenage girls who were high school and college age. So then I'm thinking, well, maybe these girls will remember the exploitation more, and maybe they'll be more traumatized. And we walk in, and instead they're these beautiful, articulate, bold girls full of dreams and ambitions, and they're practicing their English because they know that that's sort of a lifeline to opportunity. So they just want to drill me with questions if I know who Justin Bieber is or if I've met the president, and they're so fascinated. And then they sit down and start telling me their dreams. They're saying, I want to be a doctor. And they're saying it as if it's, I came out of a brothel. I'm going to be a doctor. I want to be a teacher. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be an accountant. And I'm sitting there thinking, who's helping these girls? How do these dreams come true? If I can be a part of this story. And so I came back to the States and felt like I have to do something for these kids. What do I do? And sort of kind of took this inventory of my heart and life and was like, okay, what am I doing? Like, is there anything in this sort of spirit of heroism is much more about taking who you are and the natural things that God's given you and letting those intersect somebody else in their time of need? So I was sort of trying to take inventory of my life because I didn't have a lot of money. And the only thing I could think of was that I was taking a group of friends on a trip up Mount Rainier. I was leading this climb with a group of friends. And so I pitched it to these guys. I was like, hey, I know people raise money doing marathons and walkathons and bake sales. You think people could raise money climbing a mountain? And we're like, well, we got nothing to lose. We're going to do it anyway. So again, not the most noble, right? It's sort of like, well, we're doing it. And coincidentally, it was on the 4th of July. So we're like, hey, this is the day we celebrate freedom. Why not take what we're doing to celebrate, freedom, and let's leverage that to help these kids. We'll give it a shot. Again, not particularly, I wish I could say this was like, they were so amazing and noble. No, we were going to do it anyway. And so we threw it together. We thought, well, let's try to raise $14,410, which is $1 for every vertical foot of the mountain. And let's try to do it. We actually had this idea 14 days before the climb. So it was it was last minute, which really drove home the fact that we were already doing this, you guys, but hey, 14 days, $14,410. So we threw it out there on social media, sent some emails to friends, and we ended up raising $20,000. We thought, wow, $20,000 in 14 days to help these kids. That can send several of those girls to college. That's amazing. And then some other friends said, hey, can we do the next one? I'm like, what next one? I'm like, well, now I have to plan it. Now I got to okay. So we did another one, and it kept growing. And now this thing, it's just this hodgepodge group of buddies climbing mountains. And this summer hit $500,000 raised climbing mountains. It's crazy, right? It's literally just people doing something they were already going to do, that they really like to do, and inviting people into a story to help those in need. And again, people from the outside often will hear that and be like, whoa, you put your life at risk to climb mountains for these kids? That sounds so heroic. I'm like, no, we actually are dumb enough to put our life at risk just for fun. And we were going to do it anyway, but we decided we'd find a way. And I think, again, at the core of that is that God has given each of us the tools and the opportunities to be a hero and to change the world every day. We just have to condition ourselves to look for them in the absolutely ordinary situations. It's interesting because as I kind of got more and more involved in this fight against slavery, this Climb for Captives thing took off, and then people started saying, oh, will you come and educate us about slavery? And I realized I didn't really know much. I just knew that it was really bad and I didn't like it, and I had seen it in one city. So I started researching and found that it's a huge problem around the world. In fact, there's more slaves right now on the planet than any other time in history. Somewhere between 1 out of every 150 to 200 people on the globe right now are in slavery. It's a huge number. The average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is 13 years old. 13 on the streets of Minneapolis and Seattle. It's this massive problem, so I started getting involved and felt like, okay, I got to do more. And meanwhile, I'm kind of climbing the corporate ladder and then getting involved. And I started serving on this board with the founders that I had met and helping them build the organization. And then they said, hey, will you consider doing this full time? So we had kind of a radical shift in our family kind of trajectory, what we felt like God was leading us to do. But one of the things that struck me in this transition was I had worked for this large global agency and had big Fortune 100 clients. And the company I worked for actually paid us to volunteer. So we actually got calendar days blocked out where we could go volunteer, and they would pay us to do it. And so it was essentially extra vacation time that you could only use to volunteer, which was really pretty cool, right? You get to be paid, you get free vacation time to go volunteer, but you have to use it to volunteer. You can't use it to go to Cabo or whatever. You got to volunteer. And what struck me was that a lot of people didn't use it. So they would send out these emails like, don't forget, your volunteer hours are going to expire. If you haven't used it, go volunteer. And either people wouldn't use it, or there'd be a flurry of emails in response to that of people that would say, hey, let's go and go walk dogs for the animal shelter, or let's go to the homeless shelter and serve meals. And those things are really good. People need to do those things. But what struck me was I kind of had this moment where I realized, wait a second, we're some of the highest paid marketing and communications professionals in the corporate world. And we work with the biggest people agencies in the world. And we'll sit down with companies and map out their strategy for how they can build their brand, how they can engage their audiences, how they can get their message out there. And then we'll go to a nonprofit that probably is struggling to get their message out there, that's barely able to raise funds because they don't know how to communicate to their audience, and we'll say, hey, we're here. We'll help walk dogs. We'll take professionals who are paid hundreds of dollars an hour to develop communication strategy, and we'll walk your dogs. Now, again, it's not that there's anything wrong with walking dogs, and it's not that we're above walking dogs. It's that that's not a very effective use of our skills to advance a mission. And as I was thinking about my experience on the corporate world, I found the same was true as I came into the nonprofit world, is that constantly intersecting with people. I mean, I'm in Seattle, so within a few miles of our office, we've got Amazon.com headquarters, Microsoft, Expedia, some of the biggest tech giants. Facebook has a huge office, Google has a huge office. And I'm thinking, and most of those companies pay their people to volunteer. And I'm thinking, man, if anybody has if any nonprofits out there have terrible websites and design and technology interface, we're missing something, right? Like, we've got tens of thousands of man hours, hundreds of thousands, actually more likely, hundreds of thousands of man hours of paid time to go and help, and either they don't do it or they do it in something that's not related to their natural giftings. Isn't that interesting? And I think some of that is, again, this idea that we're conditioned to look for opportunities to be heroes. And it feels very heroic to be the one that stands at the feeding line at the homeless shelter and gets to hand them a loaf of bread and say, bless you, and feel like, this is me being heroic. I saved your life, did something great. We're conditioned to look for those opportunities to be heroic, and all the while, the real opportunities are all around us, and we haven't been taught to be faithfully present. The U.S. government actually did a study on this, on volunteerism in America. Really fascinating what they found. So they studied around the country, and they found that only about 25% of working age Americans actually volunteer. Right? So if we take this room, we're going to cut it down. Only this sliver right here, a quarter of you actually would volunteer, ever. Period. Right? So that's kind of a bummer in and of itself. So 3/4 never give back. So we're down to this. So then they did another study, like, okay, well, we got that group narrowed down, now what? So they did a study on this group, and their number one finding, word for word, most volunteers, so of those 25%, most volunteers do not perform service activities that relate to their professional or occupational skills. 80%. So they broke it down, and they looked at all the different categories, and it comes out to about 80%. So of the 25, 80% of them never use their skills. So you kind of beg, like, now we're down to, 80% of 25%. I mean, so it leaves kind of like 3 people that are actually like, hey, you know what? God gave me some unique abilities and skills, and he kind of wired me a certain way. I'll make those available to advance the good in the world, to help those in need. And 80% of those people never, ever use their skills. Another 10% only occasionally use them. That it's actually only 10% of those who volunteer, so roughly 2.5% of the people here, which in this room would come down to about 1.5 people, would ever use or primarily use the things that God gave them. How tragic is that? To think that the people of God are out there looking for opportunity to proclaim God's goodness as the Creator and to be image bearers, and the things that he gave us, the natural gifts, the natural abilities, are lying dormant while we're looking for opportunity to do incredible things. And I think that is really, really tragic. What I've realized is, in those moments where I've been called a hero, really had nothing to do with me feeling like a hero. And it had everything to do with somebody else feeling like they received the critical ingredient in their time of need. Probably the most impactful moment for this was when I think I did probably the most simple thing ever, was actually on a trip to India, leaving the safe home after a few days. There was this 15-year-old girl, this beautiful girl who her mother was trafficked from Nepal, And her mother died in the streets, was horribly exploited, and she was left behind and was rescued out. And this little 15-year-old girl who's determined to learn English. She's a feisty little firecracker that has big dreams, and she knows that English is this really important ingredient for opportunity. And so she just followed me around for 3 days, drilling me with questions, wanting to practice her English. And as I got ready to leave, she came up to me and she said, I'm 15, I'm going to graduate from high school in 3 years, and I'm getting out of here. I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to pursue my dreams. I said, that's amazing. You do it. You can do it. And she said, but I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise me that before I graduate, you'll come back and see me, because once I leave, I don't know where I'll go, and I'll probably never see you again. And I need you to promise that at least one time in the next 3 years, you'll come back and see me. Well, when I started doing this work, I made a promise to myself that I would never, ever tell any of these kids that I would do something if I wasn't 100% that I could deliver. And I just didn't know. I didn't know if my plane would go down going home over the Atlantic. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know if I would make it back to see her again. And so I was kind of heartbroken trying to figure out, okay, how do I respond to this request? Like, on one hand, it's sort of the simple, come back once, just come back. And so I looked at her and I said, I'm sorry, I can't promise. I'll try. I hope I can come back. I would love to see you again. I'm so excited to see what God does with your life. And she looked really sad and looked down, and then she looked up at me and she said, I know. Do you promise me you'll remember me? Just remember me. Well, that hit me like a ton of bricks, and I, of course, didn't hesitate to say, I promise you I will never, ever, ever forget you. And I made her a promise. And it didn't feel all that heroic. In fact, it felt pretty sheepish, because I couldn't make the promise she really wanted. She wanted me to come back and to see her, and the only thing I could give her was just say, yeah, I'll remember you. And I left, and thankfully I've been back to see her a few times since then. But the first time I went back, she came back up to me, and she just walked right up to me. And she said, do you remember? And I said her name out loud, and I gave her a big hug. And it changed her world. That she was a girl that has not a single living family member on the planet. And a girl that was rescued out of a brothel. And outside of the home where she lives, there's nobody on the planet that knows she exists, right? Her safety net is 1 degree. If something happens in that home, there's nobody that remembers her, nobody that knows her, nobody that fights for her. She has nobody. No Facebook group, no distant cousin, no distant relative, nobody that I think if it all goes bad, I think I have a lifeline. She has nothing outside this home. And then some kid from a small town in Seattle comes back and says, yeah, I know your name, I'll never forget you, and I'll fight for you. And it changed everything. And it cost me nothing, except for being present and being faithful to be who God had called me to be in the place that He had placed me. So my challenge for you today is to take an inventory of who you are and to ask yourself, how has God wired you, and how can you be faithfully present where He's placed you? Because there are opportunities every day all around you to be a hero for someone, and it probably won't feel very heroic. In fact, it'll probably feel extremely ordinary until you realize down the line, and you may not realize this side of eternity, but you'll find out that you are changing lives, that you are changing the world. And that by being who you are and doing what God has wired you to do, you fundamentally can and absolutely will change the world. Thank you.